the National Bureau of Economic Research. In 2015-16, he served as a senior economist for energy and environment at the White House Council of Economic Advisors. His research focuses on energy markets, and he uses a variety of approaches ranging from structural econometric modeling to field experiments to energy economic systems modeling and economic theory. So areas of research that he's involved with include energy efficiency, new energy technologies, sustainable transportation, and recent publications have focused on the adoption of solar photovoltaic technology, market failures in household energy efficiency, and the rebound effect in transportation. And Ken has really published in literally a very wide range of publications and really some of the top journals, ranging from Science and Nature to the Journal of Association of Environmental and Resource Economists to the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy. Prior to joining Yale, Ken worked at the California Air Resources Board, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, the Stanford Energy Modeling Forum, Resources for the Future. He is a recipient of a Fulbright Fellow that took him to New Zealand. His PhD is from Stanford, where he studied management science, engineering, and economics. And before he started his career as an economist, he was a wilderness ranger in Wyoming and New Hampshire. So please join me in welcoming Ken Gillingham.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm particularly excited to give this talk because I can talk about two of the things that I most enjoy speaking about. One is my own research, and the other is policy. It doesn't get any better than this. But before I dive into my talk, I first want to give a quick overview of my research. Not all of you may know my research. I haven't spoken to each and every one of you, so I just want to give a quick overview of the areas that I'm interested in working in, because my topic, the talk that I'm going to get into, isn't going to get into all of these topics. More broadly, my research is focused on using theory and empirics, often very large data sets, to examine policy-relevant questions in a wide variety of areas. But there are three main themes, and these three main themes are the adoption of new energy technologies that may be at different spatial and temporal scales. So we could talk about adoption of new energy technologies from climate policy using integrated assessment models, which I'll talk about a little bit today. I could be talking about understanding the process of diffusion of new energy technology, so solar in Connecticut, with a series of field experiments with CBAY that we work on here, using behavioral economics to understand how to nudge people in a very nice way to encourage them to adopt solar. Energy efficiency. I'm interested in understanding consumer decisions about energy efficiency and how policies, such as efficiency standards and others, influence people's decisions about whether to buy more energy efficient products. And transportation, which intersects with the other two. I'm interested in transportation policies to reduce emissions and how these policies, the efficiency of these policies, as well as understanding actually what emissions reductions are possible for them. So fuel economy standards, policies that change the urban form, what's the relationship between urban form and driving. So that's a broad overview of my research. But this talk today is really going to be about how research makes its way into policy. And a primary goal is to provide insight into how research in environmental and energy economics influences policy at the US federal level. Now, research, even research done here from a variety of different fields, influences policy. I'm only focusing on how environmental economics influences policy because that's what I know best. So I'm drawing upon my time at the White House over the past year, where I did serve as a senior economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. And most of you may not know what the Council of Economic Advisors is. You could think about it as the analytical shop, or in another way, the little think tank within the White House that is intended to give nonpartisan advice to the president and the president's senior advisors on economic issues. So it's very small, actually. There's a chair and 2 members and 7 senior economists in various areas: tax, health, macro, and energy and the environment. Some years, there are so few people there who work on energy and the environment that the senior economist is the key person. So when I was there, I probably was the senior economist within the entire White House on energy and environment issues, which means that you play a role in a whole variety of different areas. The general task, so you'll see where this comes from as I talk more, but the general tasks that the senior economists are involved in involve writing internal memos straight to the president and president's senior advisors, involves external reports. These are reports on topics that are of interest to the administration, and particularly senior advisors, that are external facing, and you'll see some of these in the talk. As well as, and a lot of time is spent on reading rulemakings and providing a peer review, much as the same way that the other faculty here, we spend a lot of our time doing peer reviews, reading papers. These peer reviews are of 100-page or many hundreds of pages of regulatory language to analyze the analysis and review the analyses that went in. I have to give a caveat. I'm going to be talking about how research makes its way into policy, and particularly my research makes its way into policy. Different administrations, of course, may be more open to academic evidence than other administrations. I might just leave it at that. So I do think that from a broad perspective, research does make its way into policy, and often in unexpected ways and through different pathways. And I'll talk about, you'll see that come out in the talk. But they will make its way in differently. Often it's ad hoc, and it does depend on who knows who. And I will be focusing on my own research. My office when I was there was just right around the corner on the 4th floor up there. The West Wing is right here. This is the front door of the front of the West Wing. So this CEA does take a pretty prominent role. So the Council of Economic Advisors, I'm going to refer to it from now on as the CEA. The areas that I'm going to talk about today, there are a whole variety of areas where I could talk about how research makes its way into policy. But the areas that I'm going to talk about today are three that I've worked in a fair bit that I think have all had pretty interesting ways in which they made their way into policy. One is the social cost of greenhouse gases, and don't worry, I will define that for those of you who don't know. The second is the federal coal leasing program, and the third is the consumer response to fuel price changes, something that I've actually been working on for many years. So to start out, what is the social cost of greenhouse gases? Many of you may have heard of the social cost of carbon, but there could also be a social cost of methane or a social cost of nitrous oxides. These are all greenhouse gases. And so from a broad perspective, the social cost of greenhouse gases tells you when you emit one more ton of a greenhouse gas, say carbon dioxide, what are the damages to society? So what are the net present value damages to society? So if you emit one more ton of greenhouse gases today, then it will cause some damages tomorrow, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 100 years from now. So you add up all those flows and discount them back to the present, is the basic idea of what this social cost is. This social cost is particularly used in cost-benefit analyses. And I'll talk about that and how it's used in a moment. But to understand how to calculate it, I mean, there's so many components to thinking about what plays a role in the damages from a ton of carbon dioxide. You have to understand the climate system. You have to understand the energy system. You have to understand the economics for the damages. So calculating the social cost of carbon or the social cost of other greenhouse gases requires a model that includes all three of these. What you want to do is you want to understand if you put an additional ton into the atmosphere, first of all, you want to understand the path of emissions. So if you put an additional ton in the atmosphere, what context does it lie in? How many emissions are in the atmosphere already? Then when you put that ton into the atmosphere, what does that mean for warming? And how does the climate change? And then you need to go back to the economic system and understand how that is valued in terms of damages. So the models that do this are called integrated assessment models of climate change, which many of you have heard of. And this is an area I've been working on for quite a while, long before even the social cost of carbon was on most people's radar screen. So I have papers back from 2008, or almost a decade ago, that look at biofuels and integrated assessment models, or look at endogenous technological change, how technology and energy transitions occur. But my research has also explored the social cost of carbon. So I mentioned that the social cost of greenhouse gases is a broader term, but the social cost of carbon is an individual one. This is the one that has had the most attention focused on it. It's the monetized value only for carbon dioxide. And it's used in the cost-benefit analysis of environmental rulemakings to monetize the damages from climate change. So when EPA is calculating the costs and benefits of, say, the Clean Power Plan, they will have the costs, which may be costs in terms of reduced manufacturer profits and things along those lines. And then they'll have the benefits in terms of savings from climate, as well as local air pollution savings, because they're going to be reducing emissions. When you try to calculate these costs from climate, when you're actually calculating these, the social cost of carbon is what they use. So it's critical for policy. And I've been working on this for a while before I even went over to the White House. In Pizer et al., my co-authors and I highlighted the importance of this. And in this graph, you'll see a quick way that you can see how the importance are. We were looking at it before the Clean Power Plan was finished, but this was the benefits and costs of a Clean Power Plan-like regulation that looked at the costs you can see as the darker red, and the benefits, climate-only benefits, are the lighter red. If you use different values of the social cost of carbon, the 2008 value versus the 2013 value, it looks quite different on how these stack up, which indicates how important it is. So in this article in Science, we pointed out how important this can be for how stringent regulations are and the legal defensibility of regulations that are already out there. We also pointed out that there should be a process to update the social cost of carbon. And the White House actually followed this recommendation and appointed a National Academy of Sciences committee, which was interesting because then when I got to the White House, I was actually in charge of helping get this committee together. But this is just the first way in which work done here in the academic realm makes its way. People actually do read papers in science and listen sometimes. Improving the social cost of carbon and the social cost of greenhouse gases also requires advances more broadly in climate economics. So in another paper, co-authors and I think Robert and Matt might have also been co-authors on this one, we identified key areas for moving forward in climate economics in this Science article. We pointed out that IAMs should look for new evidence on climate damages, improve our understanding of who's helped and who's harmed by climate change and climate change policies, and developing, particularly with a focus on developing nations, and developing new approaches to modeling uncertainty about climate change. That last one is one where I've actually put in a great deal of work myself. Bill Nordhaus, Peter Christensen, who is a former PhD student here, now at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where he's an assistant professor there, and I performed what we consider the most comprehensive analysis of uncertainty in integrated assessment models of climate change. We looked across 6 integrated assessment models. These were models that are all used for the IPCC. The motivation for this is broadly that if you looked at the IPCC, the integration, one of the things that you'll notice is that there are lots of curves about what future scenarios may look like of the world, future emissions, future temperatures after climate change. But we don't have any uncertainty bounds on any of those. We don't know what those distributions look like. We don't even know if they should be weighted equally or weighted in a completely different way. That was the overarching motivation for this work. So this work on modeling uncertainty in climate change developed a new 2-track approach, which allowed us to understand better and develop estimates of what the uncertainty actually looks like going forward around key parameters. And the key parameters we looked at were population, economic growth, and climate sensitivity, which are key parameters that go into these models. So one of the things we did was we drew from the natural sciences. One of the things in the natural sciences, particularly in climate science, that people do often is create a reduced form, a simplified version of a model. These integrated assessment models are often very large, complicated models with hundreds and hundreds of equations, sometimes thousands of equations. that creates real challenges when you're trying to estimate uncertainty, because when you estimate uncertainty, you want to have a whole probability distribution. And it's often, these models take a long time, so running them takes a while, and you want to run them many, many times. So we created an emulator, or a surface response function, based on a grid, a set of grids and model runs. So put simply into equations for any model, let the model output variable be given by this ym. We have that a function of exogenous and policy variables and uncertain parameters. We run a set of calibration runs at the modeler's baseline and on a grid around the baseline. And then we estimate a surface response function, so a 3D function, via flexible regression. We examined a variety of different regressions, from kernel regressions to polynomials to quadratics and others, interactions. We found actually that simple, relatively parsimonious specifications work just as well as very complicated specifications. At the same time, on a separate track, we developed three uncertain parameters. We developed distributions of three uncertain parameters: population, economic growth, and GDP. We combine these two together using a Monte Carlo analysis to simulate the output variables. Because at the end of the day, what we want to see is the distribution of the output variables. These are some selected results. This paper is in review right now, so it's a working paper. But what do we find? We find a wide distribution of the social cost of carbon. So there are some really bad events in some sense. There are some cases where the social cost of carbon is quite high. And there are some cases where the social cost of carbon, where the world just lucks out, and the social cost of carbon isn't going to be quite as high. And this is what these distributions are really about, is looking at the mean. You want to understand the mean and the percentile range. Some of these models have 99th percentile, well above 100. That would lead to a very different policy than has been implemented even by the Obama administration. We also found much greater differences within model than across models, which we found to be quite interesting, because one of the ways that people have worried about this when they're working with the IPCC and in other situations is just run separate models, and that'll tell you something about what uncertainty looks like. But that's not the case when you actually run the numbers. So what we see here in this graph are box and whisker plots with the 99th and first 1 percentile of temperature change across these different models. The IGSM's MIT's model, the fund, the WICH model from Italy, the DICE model's Nordhaus's model, GCAM model from Pacific Northwest National Labs, a MERGE model from EPRI, is the Electric Power Research Institute. So these are all different models. All of these are some of the primary models used by the IPCC. And we ran and found that largely you see roughly similar results, but a lot of within-model uncertainty, which is important when thinking about the IPCC and in updating these, as well as important more directly for policy. More directly for policy, there is a social cost of carbon that the US government uses in the Clean Power Plan, in methane regulations. Well, actually, they use the social cost of methane then, in a whole variety of other environmental rules that the EPA and others use. So while I was at the CEA, I was the chair of what's called the Interagency Working Group. So it had people from the EPA, Interior, Department of Energy, other internal agencies within the White House on the social cost of carbon. We didn't change the actual methodology. The methodology was in place by the time I was there. But these results showing such wide variations led me to recommend a more careful presentation of uncertainty and really push for a more careful presentation of uncertainty in the technical support document. Part of the reason that this is important is because it's not just the US government that used this number. Canada uses this number too. Mexico uses this number. Folks in Europe have looked at this number. Several states have been using this number. Now I say this number, but importantly, the point is it's not this number. It's a distribution. And while what you see here is a central estimate at a particular discount rate, a 3% discount rate, there are quite different distributions depending on the discount rate, as well as depending on the other factors that are influencing the outcomes that you could be getting. So these are frequency distributions from the actual interagency working group, which I worked quite hard on putting together. This presentation was drawn in part from my research on uncertainty in climate policy. I oversaw this updating, including the addition of additional greenhouse gases. Now, it does remain to be seen what's going to happen with the social cost of carbon. Right now, everything relating to the environment is off the White House website, so it will be interesting to see. It's all archived. Obama archives.gov has it still up there. Currently, those in the administration are still using this, but it does remain to be seen. What's really important here is that all this hard work we did played a role into a National Academies report as well. So I mentioned before that there was that recommendation for National Academies report for updating the social cost of carbon. The National Academies largely verified the basic methodology, but pointed to some things that can be done to improve it in the future, of kind of longer range issues that should be worked on. This just came out very recently. It came out just a few weeks ago, in fact. It's an extensive report on valuing climate damages, updating estimation of the social cost of carbon dioxide emissions. And this report largely verifies much of the hard work that was done by the administration and makes it really tough legally to try and that combined with the fact that there is a Massachusetts versus EPA case that says that carbon dioxide can be treated as a pollutant makes it very, very tough to try and entirely remove the social cost of carbon from rulemaking. So not only was this playing a role directly in rulemaking when I was there, but it's going to be influencing the changes that are going to be occurring in the near future. On to my second topic. Second topic is on reforming the federal coal leasing system. This does fall within the broader range of understanding the growth in new energy technologies. Because to understand the growth in new energy technologies, you also do have to understand existing technologies and the rulemakings, the regulatory structure around existing technologies. Personally, I find the federal coal leasing system to be both intellectually interesting, but it's also been incredibly policy relevant. There's an integrated market throughout the United States. There's a lot of coal that's produced in Appalachia. There's some coal produced in the Illinois Basin. There's coal produced in the western US. Only some of it is on federal lands, not all of it. And there are a lot of calls right now. There are calls to open the lands for jobs and growth. You saw this in some of the talking points in the current administration. There are calls to keep it in the ground for climate and the environment. There was a letter written by almost over 1,000 prominent scientists recently saying that we should be effectively keeping it in the ground. By keeping it in the ground, we're talking about federal coal. And still many other calls for a fair return to the taxpayer, that the federal government is just not doing a very careful job or doing a very good job at making sure that they're getting a fair return for the value that they have that's owned by all of us. Yet with all these calls and all this going on, there's fairly limited research on federal coal leasing. And there's some tough questions. The policy context of these questions is that the Department of Interior is currently and has been undertaking a programmatic environmental impact statement process, a PEIS process, which could provide recommendations for reform. So this is a big coal mine in, this is the North Antelope Mine, actually, in the Powder River Basin of Wyoming. But when you think about reforming, it raises a series of intellectual questions. How does one model reforming? There are a few things to note. One is 40% of coal is on federal lands. That means a lot of coal not on federal lands, which raises a question. Suppose you reform the coal leasing process. Suppose you keep it in the ground, shut down all the coal on federal lands. That raises the question of what would happen. Would the coal would there just be a complete substitution? Would we just extract much more in Illinois and in Appalachia and in non-federal lands that are in the West? Or would there be a limited substitution? And what would that substitution look like? Over 85% of the coal that's on federal lands is in the Powder River Basin of Montana and Wyoming. Most of it's Wyoming. So this shows kind of that graph over time to show how dominant this Wyoming-Montana feature has become. This graph is from my CEA report. The next thing to note is that Powder River Basin, or PRB, coal prices are much below anywhere else. So the real average mine price of coal is plotted over time from 1997 to 2015 here. And you can look at the different states. What I want to really point out is the dotted line here, which you see right along here. So these are already adjusted for the heat rate. So Wyoming coal happens to have a lower heat rate than much of the coal elsewhere in the country, meaning that you have to use more of it to get as much electricity out when you burn it in a thermal power plant. So what we have here is the coal prices, even after adjusting for heat rate, are much, much lower. Why are they lower? There are a whole series of bilateral contracts across the country. These are the mine mouth prices. These are the prices right at the mine mouth. So they're not the prices after adjusting for transportation costs. So transportation costs play a role. But it's also that the coal in the Powder River Basin is really cheap. It's gigantic open pit strip mines that are being used, with some of the largest vehicles in the world actually are used to extract these. I've actually seen some of them. They're pretty amazing. So these gigantic vehicles are used, and it's an extremely efficient process. Which raises the question, again, if you reduce coal, so some of the cheapest coal in the country, what is that going to mean for the shifting that could occur? So to make some headway here, we need a model. In the work that I've done on federal coal leasing, I've used a model called the Integrated Planning Model. ICF Consulting developed this model, so it's a consultancy based in Washington, D.C. It has extensive detail on resources and the energy system in the U.S. And through this model, this is work with Jim Stock, we examined scenarios of increased royalty rates. We examined scenarios, so what if you changed the royalty rate that was actually imposed? Right now, on most federal coal, there's a maximum royalty rate of 12.5%. In the Powder River Basin coal, because of some waivers and exemptions, it's about 12.2%. In some other areas, it's a little bit lower. So right now, we're talking 12.2%. So what if you changed it from 12.2% to 17%? For coal and for oil and gas, it's 18.5%. Especially, so offshore oil and gas, especially, is 18.5%. So this led to some key findings about raising royalty rates. One is an argument that's played out throughout. If you talk to the spokesperson for the National Mining Association and ask them what they say if you raise the royalty rates, you're going to bring in less revenue. We need our revenue. You know, it's important. The tax revenue is split between the federal government and the states. The states use that tax revenue in order to fund schools and roads and a variety of other features. This is an important factor. So what happens to the tax revenue? There can be a substantial increase in royalty rates without reducing revenues, is the first point, because they don't cut back that quickly. They do start cutting back some, but they don't cut back that quickly. And the reason they don't cut that back that quickly is because much of this coal is some of the cheapest coal in the United States. And so it's still worth it to extract. What this means is that Wyoming, Montana, Utah would bring in more tax dollars. There would be a small shift in production to eastern coal and a small shift in production to natural gas. So but that shift is not sufficient from an emissions perspective to lead to more emissions overall. There is still a reduction in emissions overall. Those came from the Council of Economic Advisors report. In a recent science paper from this year, we also pointed out that there's a dramatic difference in the climate damages relative to the price for federal coal. And that's what this graph is from my science paper. So we have here the average fossil fuel spot price, 2016, for Powder River Basin coal, for natural gas, and for crude oil, and the monetized climate damages. This is coming from the social cost of carbon. There's a dramatic difference in how these are actually playing out. So Jim Stock and I worked further on this question, and we looked at what would be a sensible policy scenario. Sensible policy scenario would be adding a carbon adder to the royalty rate. So we actually matched the carbon adder to 20% of the social cost of carbon, and we found that this would bring in substantial revenues, which could be used to compensate and help some of these coal communities there's real reason to be worried about. It would dramatically help the environmental implications over the long run, because it would be starting a shift. In the short run, it would be a minor help to the environment, but may even increase net employment, which is something that the politicians care about quite a bit. As economists, we try to stay away from net employment numbers, but the folks in the White House and other politicians care a lot about that. And why is that? Because it takes far fewer people to extract a ton of coal with these huge machines in Wyoming than it does to extract coal in Appalachia or in Illinois. So you see this switch would lead to potentially even more jobs. The BLM scoping report is out. This is the BLM scoping report, January 2017. It very heavily drew upon those three papers that I was just talking about. So we see some cite about the IPM model right here, which is citing my science paper. Another key point in the science paper is that what's very, very important in the design of this option is what's going on with downstream emissions regulations. So whether or not at the smokestack, for example, we put on a clean power plan or another policy that reduces emissions at the smokestack. And this thinking led its way to some of the key findings within this BLM. Now, of course, it remains to be seen what is done. The short of it is that this interim scoping report from the Bureau of Land Management as part of their PEIS process is going to make it a little tricky for the next administration to completely ignore what's going on here. I have no idea what they are going to do. But what I feel that's been done here is an intellectual groundwork has been laid for different approaches for reform. Any reform requires a complex set of trade-offs between a variety of factors that matter a lot, everything from the environment to local economic growth and jobs and tax revenues. All of those play a role in the policymakers' decisions that they make. But now they have numbers to work with. Now there's actually a framework for them to use to think about this. So even if nothing's done for the next 4 years, well, we'll see about the following 4 years, but it will be interesting. But I think there's a very, very good case to be made that following this administration, there will be some reform here. Which brings me to my last major topic, the consumer response to fuel price changes. This is a major area of my research. I use often huge data sets of odometer readings. I hate using the big data term, but it could qualify as big data. But I also use theory. So I'm using economic theory and very large data sets to understand consumer behavior. I'll have these odometer readings from inspection data. So the vehicle inspection, when you take your car in to get it inspected, they take an odometer reading, and I'll often see the VIN. So I have this from a variety of states. And I'm particularly interested in the heterogeneity in the relationship between fuel prices and driving. Often I'm estimating models that are something simple. VMT stands for vehicle miles traveled. So the amount driven, and I look to see what the relationship between the amount driven is and gasoline and a whole variety of other characteristics, often which can be interacted or separated. This has implications for energy efficiency and the effects of energy policies, which I'll get into. This is a map that tells you a little bit, gives you a kind of a sense about one of the papers that I've worked on. This is a paper in Energy Economics from 2015, where you see onboard inspections were introduced in different times. These onboard inspections have odometer readings in Pennsylvania, and much of Pennsylvania is covered by this. So I'm using these types of these data, and I've used them in Pennsylvania, in California, where I have several papers, in Massachusetts, where I have some work understanding the relationship between urban form and driving, and as well understanding there's a new insurance approach that some of you may have seen, where you can actually pay insurance by the mile instead of, in some sense, a fixed, where you tell them how much you drive. So if you pay by the mile, that might actually change incentives on the margin for how much you drive. So we have detailed data from Oregon, Illinois, and California, along with data from a company, Metromile, that does this, to better understand what that might do to the insurance market, as well as what the behavioral impacts are. And this is with Steve Berry and Jim Levinson from Econ and School of Management. And as well in Denmark, I've been working on this. How do these results make their way into policy? In the January 2016 State of the Union address, there was a key sentence, a sentence I was very happy about, that the president read something about that I was directly working on. But he says, I'm going to push to change the way that we manage our oil and coal resources. So the coal relates very much to the PEIS process and the work I was doing there, so that they better reflect the costs they impose to taxpayers and our planet. So in the 2016 budget request, Obama proposed a $10 per barrel Pigouvian fee on oil consumed. By Pigouvian, I mean it's intended to correct externalities from oil consumption. So one of the things we did was actually value the different externalities, see what the tax was, and look at how close can we get to getting closer to an optimal one. That $10 per barrel turns out to be about a quarter per gallon of gasoline. So we're talking about a 25% raise. And it was to be spent on areas of high social value. Infrastructure is one of them, including sustainable infrastructure and climate-resistant infrastructure, and a portion to affected low-income households. And this gets into the heterogeneity question. So here you'll see it. This was a New York Times article by Coral Davenport. She was pretty close to being right on everything, so that's just pretty good, actually. CEA and Treasury did all of the calculations behind what was going on here, and I kind of, in some sense, was leading many of these calculations. How large should the fee be? How much of a gallon of gasoline increase in price are we talking about? How much revenue would it raise? Because you need to know that in order to know how much you have to spend on bridges and roads and climate-resilient infrastructure. What would the emissions reductions be? Should it be imposed on plastics, other petrochemical liquids? If the goal is to address externalities, you want it to be on the amount that's actually combusted. So one of the things that was decided was actually to take out plastics and other petrochemical liquids. Who is helped and who is harmed, and by how much? The role of research, the elasticity of gasoline demand that comes out of my work, turns out to be critical. This elasticity tells you, if you change the price of gasoline, how much less do people drive? So if you want to know what the environmental implications are, if you want to know the final result about what the driving would be after the policy, you need some estimate about what that's going to look like. And so I have estimates that come from mine, negative 0.1 in the short run, 0.3 to negative 0.4 in the longer run. But for this last question, who's helped and who's harmed, the distributional impacts are also critical. And so a lot of my work focuses on who is helped and who's harmed from different policies that influence. And this is a map here again of Pennsylvania, where you see Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And you'll see many areas that turn out to actually not be very wealthy areas, and in more rural areas that people drive a lot. And I could also present a similar graph about how much they respond. And the amount they drive and how much they respond are the two factors that really weigh in to who is helped and who's harmed. And this all played a role in setting aside some funding to help those who we expect to be particularly harmed from any type of policy that we know is going to improve the environment. It's also relevant to energy efficiency policy. It provides guidance on the rebound effect, which was mentioned. The rebound effect can be defined in many different ways, but I'd just call it the behavioral and market responses to increase fuel efficiency that can reduce fuel savings. There was a David Owen article in New Yorker that shows, I love this one, people running away with electricity, pointing out that backfire could occur, that if you raise energy efficiency and improve energy efficiency, you might find a case where you're not going to save any energy at all because people are going to respond and just drive a bunch more or use their appliances a bunch more. So my work took this seriously and said, okay, what if this is the case? with a careful review of the literature, backfire is unlikely. I have a paper in the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, and a more detailed, that's a more detailed paper for a shorter Nature paper that points out that increasing energy efficiency will, in general, be expected, given a very careful review of the literature and a lot of our own work, to reduce energy use and emissions. But what's especially policy relevant and what has made its way into policy is welfare as well. And one of the points that we make is that the rebound effect itself should not be used as it was being used by David Owen and has been used in the past. There's an Institute for Energy Research report saying why you should never do an energy efficiency standard because that would mean that you're going to end up using more energy. And what we point out is that welfare matters here. So unless the externality costs are very, very high, the rebound effect is welfare improving. It actually adds to the benefit side, not just the cost side, in these cost-benefit analyses of energy efficiency standards. I've been very kind to you and not added too many equations, but this is a good equation, so I had to add this one. We did develop an expression for the welfare effects, and there are a few just things I'm going to point out. SW is social welfare here, and eta there is efficiency. We have here the averted social costs with no rebound effect. So if you improve efficiency, you suddenly have a more efficient appliance or a more efficient car, and you don't drive anymore, your driving stays exactly the same, you're going to have some fuel savings right off the bat. And that means you combust a little less fuel, and the externalities are less. So the price, that's the price of fuel, and these are from the externalities. So already you have some averted social costs. But then there's the direct rebound effect. This shows how much more the S1 is a service, how much more you would drive if you change the efficiency. So if you change the price of driving. So if it's a little cheaper to drive, you might drive a bit more. And that's what this direct rebound effect is. And so there we point out that there are factors. So one is if you drive more, you pay a little bit more for gasoline, you also combust a bit more, but at the same, and you might have some other externalities, you might increase congestion a bit, but you're also getting some welfare out of it. And so depending on how large these external costs are and the added welfare you're getting out of it, because maybe you get to go see grandma again, or you get to go pick up something you needed to pick up. Depending on how those weigh against each other, these can be net benefits or costs. This usually has a negative sign. Similarly, there's an indirect rebound effect, and that has a parallel. It's parallel. So this was new to the literature. This is published in the Journal of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists with a former PhD student from here, Nathan Chan. This idea that welfare could be improving from the rebound effect is now in rulemakings. The Department of Energy promulgated over 50 energy efficiency rulemakings since 2008. Some of them might be subject to the Congressional Review Act, we'll see. Many of these recent rulemakings reference this work for further justification of the policies. And I know this because I actually wrote some of the language in a few of them when I say you're missing key points here. I remember talking to the lawyers, they're like, this is very, very helpful. This will make our rulemakings more legally robust. Because one of the greatest factors that influence how rulemakings are written is the legal defensibility. So to finish, this talk has hopefully provided some insights into how research, well, I'll say it's my research at least, which I like talking about, makes its way into policy. Of course, research from a variety of other areas makes its way into policy. I saw how natural science research makes its way into policy. I saw how other social science research makes its way into policy as well. But this is how the environmental economics research makes its way into policy. Much of it is through government staff reading what we work on. But research really does enter into the advice given to presidents. I've seen that through internal memos. Enters into rulemakings. And I also would argue it enters into a surprisingly ad hoc manner. It just depends on who's there in the staff and what they've read. And people do read a variety of articles. But the bottom line is the more policy relevant work is, the more likely it is to enter. And so I've worked over the past several years to do as policy relevant work as possible. With that, thank you very much. So we have live stream, so you'll need to speak into the microphone, but we have just a few minutes for questions. Yes.
Ken, one thing we know in ecology is that whenever we build a model, it's our imagination of the truth. It's not necessarily the truth, and I suspect that's true in economics too. The advantage we have is we can do experiments and test the models to see how true they are, which is a lot harder to do both ethically and logistically in economics. So how can you know when you drive the model results into policy that you're right, and that the policy will actually be the right kind of policy that does actually accommodate how the world really works?
That's a great question. And I completely agree with you that models are the modeler's understanding of reality. And often models are used in different ways and designed for different purposes. One of the key ways that we try to think about this is to not be too stuck on one model. Is to try and look across several models, or as many models as we find available, and look into each of them and see whether we find this is reasonable, and look for robust results. Look for results that we find to be true across a range of models, that we truly feel are capturing relationships that really are there. In there. And if you're finding the same result across a whole suite of model structures, you have much more confidence. You never know anything for sure, but you have much more confidence that you're capturing the relationships because you're bringing in the thinking of not just you, but of several different modelers. Now there could be groupthink. There are still issues with that I acknowledge, and that you have to think carefully about. But the more evidence that you have, the more comfortable you feel. Which is why when I was referring to that Nature paper on the rebound effect, we read a lot of papers in the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy. We really reviewed as much as possible to try and bring a greater level of confidence that we're capturing the right thing. Next question. Is there one over there?
Thank you for a wonderful, insightful talk, as always. So as you know, I'm also very interested in our scientific work becoming used to improve things in the real world. And one thing I've appreciated about learning from your time in DC is about how the scientific research is incorporated in an ad hoc manner, in addition to the kind of systematic reviews that are done at EPA and Connecticut Environment with Dan and Esty and elsewhere, where scientists and staff at EPA are doing systematic reviews of our research as well. So I just want to make sure everyone knows that it's not just happening in an ad hoc review. But I wondered if you could share some insights with the group that you shared with me about how we as scientists can help make sure that our work that goes into the peer-reviewed literature is best suited to be interpreted by these people who are experts, but perhaps not in our field, perhaps not scientists, when they're reading our peer-reviewed science that is not just having an audience of other scientists in our field so that it can be the most relevant for the policymakers who want to use it?
That's a great question. There are really two parts to that. One is that you're absolutely right, that there are systematic review processes, that and EPA is quite good at doing these as well, but other agencies do these as well. Those are incredibly important, and you've played a key role in some of those yourself. And those several regulations that I could talk about for a long time do use that information in a deep way. So that engagement is one answer. Engagement in review processes, engagement in talking to the policymakers is really a quite key area. Now, working through those review processes, you're probably mostly talking to civil servants at that stage. But the understanding of the civil servants is really important because at the end of the day, what they understand and write up is what gets lifted later on to the White House level. So that is part of it. And the second part of it is we have to watch the news. We have to think about what's on the table and try and now the challenge with this is that research takes a while. So we have to think about what's on the table that is going to still be on the table 6 months from now, maybe more like 8 months from now, maybe more like 12 months from now, or 15 months from now when the research is complete. And I think that going for really broad issues that underpin the fundamentals is what's really key here. So I think, how are we doing, Karen? Okay.
Thanks for the talk, Ken. I wanted to pick up on Oz's question. I took one of the things that he was mentioning was that in natural systems, sometimes you have the ability to control the environment and identify causal effects to test your theories. And I was wondering if you could, in an economic system, social systems, you don't have as much ability to do that. I was wondering if you could comment on, in your own original research, some of the ways that you seek to overcome that, to come up with causal mechanisms to test theories.
Yeah, I think that's a great question as well. I spend much of my time when I'm working with data sets to try and estimate causal relationships, to really understand more deeply what the relationship is, taking it with confounders dealt with. To do that, economists use several approaches. Sometimes we do use field experiments, and some of my work actually involves large-scale field experiments. Those are often very expensive, and you have to be very careful about how you do them, make sure you go through the IRB process, and et cetera. So that's one option. But other options involve taking advantage of natural experiments that occur. An example of that would be the paper that I had mentioned before where I'm working with, well, actually I didn't mention this paper. I'm working with Paige Weber, who's one of my PhD students, on the benchmarking and retro-commissioning rules in New York City. And New York City rolled out the rules that required mandatory benchmarking and retro-commissioning, which basically means an energy audit of buildings, of large commercial buildings. They rolled it out in a randomized way because they rolled it out first with some tax IDs. That was randomized, picked on the last number of the tax ID, and then later on some tax IDs. So that's another example where you can find a natural experiment in the world that mimics the kinds of field experiments that you can run in ecology. There are other cases where you use other approaches as well, where you look at, they're called instrumental variables approaches, but finding something that's randomized in the world that allows you to mimic this idealized field experiment. And that's what we spend a lot of time doing as economists, and I particularly spend a lot of time doing in my own work.
I want to go back to the beginning of your talk about the social cost of carbon. And I noticed that one of your variables that you varied was actually the growth rate.
Yeah.
And it seems to me, in the end, you showed us different results for different discount rates. And it seems to me that I would discount the future differently if I knew what my future incomes were. So if I knew my income would be growing, I would apply a higher discount rate. And if I know my income is stagnant, I would maybe apply a lower discount rate. Is this something that has entered your research?
That's a very, very good question. There's something called the Ramsey rule that people use, in which the discount rate to use is a function of the economic growth. The graph that I showed at the end was one that I had worked on and was based on the methodology that the Interagency Working Group on Social Cost of Carbon used. We did not change that methodology during the time that I was there. There was not the political will to do it at that point. But I think you are exactly right that there is a relationship between the economic growth rate and the discount rate to be used. However, there are a whole variety of other things that weigh in to the discount rate. And that could be a longer conversation, but the short of it is that you will be using the discount rate they're both ethical considerations as well as market considerations. What do people actually use in their own lives? What discount rate do they use in their own lives? And there's a capital discount rate and a consumption discount rate. So the short answer to your question is simply that this is a factor that we actually we probably spent an hour, I remember, with some fairly high-level people talking about at one point. I paid close attention to it. It has not entered into the policy world yet because it's sort of a secondary topic that only people like you and me think about. But it is a real factor that can be considered further in improving. And actually, in that National Academy of Sciences report, they talked about this as well. So I would call this a factor that's potentially important, but second order to other larger factors in both the choice of the discount rate, which is why it's been subsumed for the moment.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but Ken, you've given us a lot of positive thoughts going forward in terms of thinking about the robustness of science and policy. So please, everyone, please join me in thanking Ken.